We've got a long way to go.
We're going to talk about other documentaries for Walper that you did. Are we going? Okay. Like Prelude to War, and who the narrator on that was?
I think that was Base Heart. We had some great narrators. Missed them terribly. You really get married to narrators after a while. When you're writing the script, you hear it in their voice, and nobody else sounds quite right or does it quite right again. Prelude to War was like it was a Men in Crisis show blown up. It was the Munich conference, Chamberlain versus Hitler. Only in that case, I think we did the hour first, and then we did the half hour, which was the pilot for Men in Crisis. It's all coming back. And it was a great natural story, and it made the Men in Crisis concept gel. What we didn't realize or fully realize is how few stories were quite like that. There's a drama of character, and they met, and the way they interacted really did determine the fate of the world. And if Hitler had been a little less opportunistic, if Chamberlain had been just a little bit more courageous, if they got out of the bed on a different side during the Munich conference, the whole World War II might have been avoided or at least modified. So that was that.
And what about the Epic of Flight?
A stock show entirely about aviation, and of course airplanes, model airplanes. That was right where I lived, so I had a wonderful time. No, it was a UA special. As I say, Walper was selling faster than we could make. He just sold a set of, I think, 6 United Artists. Maybe it was 12-hour specials, stock footage subjects, and off we went.
So how did this one, the Epic of Flight, fit in with your interests?
Well, I've been building the model airplanes. I love planes and aviation, and this was a great romp. And actually, by that time, we were being allowed to do a little bit of independent journalism, and I did interview Igor Sikorsky in person, which was an incredible experience, and the guy named Benjamin Fouloy, who was the Army Signal Corps officer who rode with Orville or Wilbur Wright, I forget which, in the original demonstration of the airplane for the U.S. government at Fort Myer, Virginia in I'm not sure, maybe 5. But he was the observer, and he sat down and he went for an airplane ride when nobody had been for an airplane ride. And he was dying in a military hospital near Washington. But he could still tell the story. It was incredible.
So what year was this that you saw him
This was 63, 64. I just then beginning to get a taste of what it was like to go out and do things instead of just go to the library.
Now, who was Jack Kluge?
John Kluge. Oh. John.
John Kluge.
I think it's John. I don't think I ever met him. He built Metromedia and bought Walper from Walper and put all that money in everybody's pockets.
Now, you were just saying, not on camera, but how Walper and Kluge met. Can you tell that story?
Well, the story goes, and I don't know that it's true, but the story goes that David was really hard up, and although this company had been so successful, there wasn't any money to speak of, and he went to New York to look for financing. And his first day, he met Kluge in the dining room of his hotel, and they started talking, and the deal was done. And it was a very good deal for those days, and it set everybody up of the sort of partners.
How did this buyout of Metromedia buyout of Walper, how did that affect you and what you were doing?
Well, it made me more dubious about continuing to work for Walper, and I can't remember what the politics were, but I was thinking that we were losing momentum, And I think it was only because we were going 1,000,000 miles an hour to begin with. We were only going 700,000 miles an hour. But I was thinking that the future was not going to be as exciting as the past, and it was time to get out of there.
But now, when did you make talking about going back to the National Geographic special, I mean, when did that happen?
Oh, well, here's how that happened. And I can go back and just fill in a brief period.
Yeah, that would be great.
After college, I went to work for Potomac Films in Washington. I think I had a couple of years with them, and realized that I needed to go to L.A. or New York. But one of my last desperation tries before I went there was to go over to Geographic, where my boss knew somebody and had a job interview, and I suggested they start an educational film department that obviously I would do or work for, and they were not interested. And very shortly after that, I went to L.A. This whole Walper thing started. And in 64, 65, Geographic, having decided that they would indeed do television, started their own television division under the Bob Doyle, who we were talking about, who was the founder of the National Geographic Television Department. They made a bunch of films, and let me just fill in a little of that, because Geographic, it's interesting now, because Geographic is the only American magazine that really made a successful translation into television and stayed there. And the reasons are kind of interesting. Certainly one is that it was a monarchy in those days, and it was controlled by the Grosvenor family, and the then in-charge Grosvenor was a very dynamic editor and brilliant guy. And what he said goes. And he was invited to be a guest on Omnibus, which was an early kind of classy talk show. He was probably the first Grosvenor to appear on television, and he went up and showed a little film and talked. And when he came in, as the story goes, when he came into the office the following day, the black man who rode his private elevator up to the third floor every day of his life, said, "Dr. Grosvenor, I saw you on TV last night. You were wonderful. My whole family saw it." And this guy was thrilled. And Grosvenor thought, anything medium that can reach into this guy's home and, get him excited and his family should be what we're doing. So he got out of the elevator, they say, and said, "There shall be National Geographic Television." And everybody said, "Yes, boss." And they started spending money and so on. But Grosvenor didn't understand television the way he should have. He made one phone call, it is said, to Stanton, Bill Stanton, who was the co-head of CBS, and just said, his personal friend, said, "We're going to do this, we're going to make these programs, will you put them on?" And Stanton said, "Oh, anything you do, sure, don't worry about it." So he actually started production, I think, on 5 specials. We should wait.
And then when we come back, will you tell me which Grosvenor it was that you're talking about?
Yes,
Don't tell me
although
yet.
it's hard to keep your Grosvenor straight.
Are there many?
Well, no, but they kept using the same name.
Oh.
This Grosvenor, Melville Bell Grosvenor, was, I think, the second of 3 generations of Grosvenors who ran Geographic. And what I'm talking about happened in the early 60s. Anyway, they made, just out of the box, started making, anyway, 5 very expensive films. They finished 1 or 2, hired a lot of people, set up a department, before they went up to CBS and had Stanton make good on his promise. And then he found out, people found out long, that, even the president of the network doesn't program a network, and the people who program the network want to put on what they think is going to work and nothing else. So he showed his shows, and they said, "No, thank you." we don't think it's going to work. And I guess then he took them to the other networks, and they all said the same thing. And I don't know how it happened. Probably Walper and Bob Dahl know exactly how it happened. They said, well, if you take this project to Walper and he gets a hand in it, we'll put it on the air, but you need some help. So Geographic came out, and, it's like someone bringing in a car engine that they've taken apart and can't get back together again, and at a last resort take to a mechanic. Came into Walper and said, here it is, can you fix it? And it was a huge mess. But I was right there. And I was interested in sailboats, and I'd come from the East, and I'd actually lived in Washington, and I knew, I read National Geographic. And the rest of the crowd at Walper was pretty urban, pretty New York, not where Geographic was coming from. So I got in on the ground floor of that, and I forget where I started, but that's how Geographic got rolling.
I think we're talking about how Geographic first got started in television, and that Walper connection, and what Walper wanted to do with the Geographic specials.
Right.
What was his notion, and what was the overall mission from the standpoint of National Geographic?
Well, from National Geographic's point of view, they just wanted to be on television and influence a big audience. They had no money problems doing that. They were prepared to lose money if necessary. And from Walper's point of view, our point of view, we had gotten a pretty well-established method. We knew what we were doing, or we thought did. We needed to tell a story, and we needed to establish characters, and we needed to do what we'd been doing with all these other shows. So they needed to be fixed up.
So the Geographic had these 5 shows they started with, and then what was the first show that you worked on? Was that
that was Voyage of the Brigantine Yankee, which had been done and was complete with narration by Hans Conried, and it just wasn't very good. And I took it, and it was from existing material anyway. I just took it and re-edited it quite a bit and rewrote. Did a little shooting, and finished it in a pretty short time, probably 6 weeks of editing. And at that point, that was my first network special. And I remember that I was so junior, if I did something good, I usually got it taken away from me at the point when there was any glory in it. So it was almost a stealth project. I worked very fast and very hard and just kept my head down, and got it to a point, screened it, I think, for Alan Landsberg, and he said it was fine. And I went back to Geographic and showed it to Melville Bell Grosvenor as the new, now revised and fixed National Geographic films, and he loved it. And it was just like magic. And suddenly, was in charge. And then going back to Walper, no one was going to argue with me or say the film wasn't any good when Geographic had already approved it and loved it. And this whole romance was getting off the ground. So I made some big strides there without much trouble.
Now, you talk about it being stealth. Was the writing and the filming, did you do that?
Yeah. Filming hardly anything. I went to Gloucester, where all the voyages of this particular ship had started, and filmed some atmosphere and some sync. There was no sound. I was got a lot of 16mm Kodachrome, but no sound at all. Just having a bell in a bell tower and people in the streets was, adding to it. And then it was just editing it into a way that made sense. The Geographic, they tried to do it kind of the way they would do a magazine article, with a variety of scenes not necessarily related to the text. And if you've ever tried to go through Geographic and you see an interesting picture and you try and find background, it may not be there at all, but it's certainly on another page and you have to hunt for it. So they kind of brought that method into making a TV show, not appreciating how linear it has to be. So we kind of made them linear.
So you really wrote it in a way that it would.
Yeah. Well, by this time we were doing picture first, so, but, picture and words came along side by side.
Now, who directed the show? Did you direct it, or was it Ray Jewell?
Ray Jewell would, I think, have gotten the director's credit, if anyone. He had gone, well, it was about this couple who made 7 around-the-world voyages on a 100-and-some-foot sailing ship with teenagers doing most of the work. And the kids paid for the privilege. It was kind of an outward bound before its time. And they made these incredible trips without losing a soul in the years, say, from 1934 to the 50s. And they filmed almost every trip. And Ray Jewell was one who made a trip with them as a youngster and then made 2 later trips, filming exclusively. And he had custody of the lecture films that they had been making. So Ray was the original source. I didn't go anywhere.
Well, now, how was the show scored? Was it all natural sound, or did it have a...
It was damn little natural sound with it. But that was Elmer Bernstein. He did the score, and that's where he came up with the National Geographic theme. Da-da-da-dum, dum, da-dum, 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 dum. And it was in my recording session, and, it was really quite exciting.
How did that happen? Talk about that, because I've always been curious about that.
It was part of Wolfer's prestige in those days, and I think maybe had to do with how frustrated musicians were because they were dying to do documentaries, and the best people in the business. And Elmer was very hot at the time. He'd done the Marlboro Man theme and so forth. He was eager to do this show. And Mel Stewart was a great music buff. I think he had been trained as a musician, as a matter of fact. Anyway, he latched on to Elmer, and it happened that my show had the biggest orchestra, so it was perfect for doing the theme, and that was pretty much that.
So it was first introduced with your show.
Yeah, got a cough. Can we stop for a second?
Sure.
Narrator was Orson Welles, and there's a story there too, because I did the first show was Americans on Everest, which Geographic had made very well, and it was done. The next one up was Brigantine Yankee, and I think the third one was Miss Goodall and the Wild Chimpanzees. And another producer edited that one together. And it happened that they came to a boil at the same time. We needed to record the narration with Wells on the 2 shows. And the other producer had gone off, and there was no one to do it but me. And in the tradition of having things taken away from you, even after I had my airplane ticket to go to Paris to record the narration with Wells, I thought I was going to be snatched back from the airport. And it was the first time I'd been let out of the country on the company's money. It was pretty fantastic. Went over with Bob Doyle, and we were to record the following day or whatever, soon after our arrival. But when we got there, Wells's agent, the Count du Tosca, as he was called, said, well, Mr. Wells is very busy. He won't be able to do it until he has a break in the schedule, and he's working on this film and so forth. Stay in your hotel, wait, and we'll call you. Well, we stayed in the hotel 2, if not 3 days, and here I am in Paris on an expense account, the world at my feet, and I can't leave the hotel room because Mr. Wells is going to call at any moment. And they wouldn't even give us, a good idea. It was just stay and wait for him to do it at his pleasure. So finally the call came, sure enough, late at night. And we got in a cab and we went far out into the suburbs to the studio where Wells was working. And after waiting quite a long time there, he showed up, went into the recording booth, picked up the first script and read the T's badly. And I pressed the call button and said, well, that was good, but you dropped the word this, and if you use a little bit more energy, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And there was a long silence, and Wells said, well, you're not presuming to direct me. And I, full of chutzpah, but also just full of resentment at the way we've been treated, said, well, I didn't come all this way and wait for 3 days just to sit here sucking my thumb. I don't think I was quite that eloquent, but you get the idea. And there was another long silence, and then he stood up, and, these long flowing black robes, God, an imposing figure. Not even thinking that he's Orson Welles. And he stormed out. And on his way out, he said, you, Mr. Noxon, are an impudent little snot. And that was it for that night. And we went back to the hotel. Next day, Bob Doyle did some negotiation, and we reunited, and we did another recording session. And he agreed to take comments after he had done the whole recording. And so we did it point by point, and I'd say, I want you to do this over again because. And if he agreed, he'd do it. If he didn't, he wouldn't. After all this time, I came back to L.A. with a pretty good recording of one script, a dreadful recording on the other. I didn't even have 2 takes on many things. And I thought it was over. Completely blown it. And of course, the word had gotten back, and everybody thought it was hugely funny. And I walked into Mel Stewart's office, and everybody roared and said, oh, you're a little impudent little snot. What did you say to Wells? And it was great. And he did re-record again in Madrid, some more. And, through negotiation, we dragged it out of him. And, of course, the reviewers all said Orson Welles' masterful narration lifts this otherwise pedestrian travelogue, to the level of art. So, But it was fun and interesting and disillusioning because I really thought Wells was the consummate artist and wouldn't do anything badly. But he was in a hurry. He would have just, given us toilet paper.
And what was Bob Doyle's role on the...
He was in Washington. He was head of the television department, and they had a few other little irons in the fire, educational films and so forth. But mainly, he was just Geographic's man on the spot. And he's a nice fellow, and he had a hard job because between Geographic and Walper, there was always something stirring.
Who would come up with the choices for the next shows, what your next Geographic would do?
I think they were largely dictated by Geographic. I'm sure there was some proposed. There was one, I remember, Washington, Irving, Spain, which was their idea, and which Walper didn't like, and CBS didn't like, and it never got aired. But for the most part, Geographic would come up with the ideas, and Walper would say, okay, we'll do them. And I think CBS pretty much took what came. The test of that was the Dr. Leakey show, which is the next one I did for them.
Yeah, tell us about the next Geographic special you did.
Well, that was it, Dr. Leakey, and they had made a film. Actually, it too was finished, about Leakey, who discovered all these bones of our primitive ancestors in East Africa. And they had, again, made a film where the story didn't have much to do with the pictures. And because they were convinced that, well, for 2 reasons. They were scared to death of evolution. They never used the word in the magazine. And whenever they even hinted at it, they got a lot of mail from the Bible Belt. And 2, they were convinced that what Leakey did, Stones and Bones, was inherently boring and uninteresting, not dramatic. So they had to they thought they had to make a story that deftly avoided all this. And what they ended up with was incomprehensible. You just didn't know what this old guy was doing, wandering around picking up rocks. And they never combined it all into, a sense of a career and an accomplishment and a goal. It was all monkeys in the tent poles and, the game he would see driving to work. But when he got to work, nothing happened. So anyway, they asked me if I would do this, and I went back and when Leakey was lecturing in Washington, and I met with him, and fortunately he said, well, what do you think's wrong with this film? And I said, because it doesn't tell what you do. And he was terribly pleased, and of course that's what disappointed him most. So we were off to the races, and I went to Africa and shot that, and had another editing process, and that's the second show I had on.
Now, how was that written, and how did the filming and the writing, and the shot planning and the location shooting all go together?
Well, that was more complicated than things I'd done before, because there was a lot of existing film, and some of it was quite good. So I edited a good number of sequences, put them in some kind of order, and then mapped out the things I thought I had to have, which was largely Leakey, actually doing something and talking about it. And he was very good on camera, and they'd never used him to best advantage. And for instance, he or I came up with the idea of doing a time walk down Olduvai Gorge and starting at the top in the modern day and then going down and making steps. And it's an incredible place where the stratigraphy is linear. You can start at the top, and every step you take gets you older, down to the 2 million area where he found this primitive ancestor of ours. So it was a natural thing to do, and we did it, and, filled all that in. It was very exciting, though.
Well, what was the impact of the show when it aired?
It was great. The critics all said, groundbreaking television. Who knew? It was a case of having a whole new kind of packet of knowledge that certainly hadn't been on TV before. This is before The Naked Ape, before any of the real popularization of the subject. So it was terrific.
Now, was this scored as well?
Yes.
What was the music for this?
This was Lenny Rosenman. Not sure what's become of him. He did a very atonal, dissonant, spooky good score. Wonderful in those days. We can't afford it now, but you'd go out and hire the guy, and he'd hire a symphony orchestra and, play you the piece.
So what was your next Geographic special? Was it Yankee Sails Across Europe?
Right. That was simultaneous, and that was a sequel to Brigantine Yankee, the same couple, after they retired from around the world, built a boat that was specially designed to cruise the canals and rivers of Europe, and they ran it as a charter. They would take guests, and they would go around Europe. We shot that entirely.